Let's go back in time, July, August 1982, Bassmaster magazine. I like the cover of this one because really it's one of my favorite people in many, many ways. And it was Mr. Tom Mann there, Eufaula, Alabama, Mann's Lure Company. But he did a lot more than just design lures. He basically design rods and reels and product, but he also, you know, one of the hardest things back then, a lot of people probably don't realize nowadays, a lot of conservation agencies, when BASS went to catch and release, did not want to, they thought catch and release was not going to be good for fishing. They didn't think the fish could survive. And I know a lot of that was attributed to the early bass boats and the poor live well systems we had, if no live well systems at all in the beginning. But that evolved very quickly, and the live well systems nowadays are incredibly sophisticated. But the other thing that Tom did in that area, biologically, I mean, fishing-wise, was he caught this bass that he nicknamed Leroy Brown. And this article here is, and he had it in his big aquariums in Eufaula for years, and it finally died, okay? But one of the most interesting things that came from Leroy Brown is that Leroy would never ever hit another lure after he caught him the first time. You know, he had him in this big tank, and normally bass, well, after they've been in there a day or two, they get hungry, they're gonna start biting again. And he would not. He would not, and no matter how much he tried to trick that bass into hitting an artificial lure, it would not. And for most of the other fish in there, after a couple of days, were ready to eat again. Well, why is that important? Well, when I get back to the fact that, you know, catch and release wasn't really bona fide at that time, people go, well, does it really work, blah, blah, blah. One thing that and Tom actually presented this to me one time. He said, you know, what I've learned from Leroy is that if it wasn't for catch and release, we would eventually not be able to catch 90% of the fish in the lake, because all we would have left in the lake are the non-biters. And you say, well, don't they take them out too when you catch them? Well, we're assuming there's 50, let's say 50% of the people keep the fish, 50% don't. Well, the 50% that don't, yeah, keep the fish, are going to let their Leroys back in, and eventually he won't bite again, so he's not going to have to go through that possibility of being put in the frying pan again, where all the others would. So eventually you'd swing the genetics in the lake to mostly Leroys, the non-biters, and so for catch and release has actually done the opposite. It's allowed to leave all the biters in, along with the non-biters. So it was a pretty important realization on Tom's part.
Did you say earlier that he was also partially responsible for the hummingbird?
Yeah, Tom, man, a lot of people, he did, you know, Lawrence came with the first recognized depth finders. There's other companies too, but they didn't hang around very long. They weren't very well made. But Tom brought about, there was a kit you could get, I forget the name of the company, but it was a kit that you could build your own depth finder, okay? And Tom got that kit, and he at the plant there, they started building their own depth finders, and they called them a hummingbird. Typical name for Tom Mann, hummingbird. But it was a great name. But anyway, so Humminbird nowadays is one of the top 3 depth finder companies in the country. Mann does not own it anymore, but still he's the one that brought the Humminbird to the fishing industry and the fishing market. This is, again, something I'm really trying to figure out why I did this page. Sometimes I do that and then I forget why I did that. Oh, I know what it is. So many of the big record bass back then, and you got to remember this is about 50 years ago, were caught on live bait. So the question was, do they count as a world record or do you have to put them in different categories? Almost all the record spotted bass now that come out of California, almost all the original ones were caught on water dogs. Where in Florida, all the Floridas were caught on golden shiners. And so this is kind of what this article is about, is which one should count as a world record, which one should not. I mean, you know, it's typical anglers trying to, because again, even I have problem with using live bait for bass, because that's natural, okay? They have to eat live stuff. And so my little young Rick Clunn brain thought, well, that's not fair to be using if this is it's a really a fair sporting deal between us and a natural creature, then let's make it somewhat, give it a chance to make the final decision. You don't make the final decision necessarily when they have to eat, you know, crawfish but with lures, yeah, they kind of are making the final decision whether or not they're going to participate. So even with me, this kind of touches me in that way, because I know my very first bass I caught on a red and white Lucky 13 changed my whole life when it came to that. I thought, wow, that fish. And now, of course, I was just a 6-year-old kid. I didn't do anything. I just threw it out there. And he was probably just sitting still when he paused when he come up and hit it. But still, you know, typical human, mentally I said, golly, you know, I tricked that fish. And that was much more exciting to me than using a cricket or a grasshopper or something else. Now we're still in the middle of 1982 in the tournament year, and I'll just give you a little bit of updates here. Lake of the Ozarks, I got me a second place. It was only a little over a pound behind Randy Behringer from Waco, Texas. And this third place gentleman, Jimmy Crisp, he's from Seymour, Missouri. He's no longer with us, but he was a unique angler because of what he fished 80% of the time. Most of the time he threw a Mag 18 Rapala. That's that long. And he'd throw it out, and it was a floater. It wasn't a suspender back then. He'd throw it out there, and then he'd jerk it down and let it float back up. And he'd fish it all day long. And it's kind of like that, the action you have to give with this really traumatic jerk. You have to be in shape to do that. But Basil Bacon was another one who fished that bait, but not very many. It was basically a southern Missouri, northern Arkansas technique that very few anglers, but it was a big fish bait. I mean, and that, a lot of guys, I know Shorty Evans from Houston, Missouri, the old Undertaker. He way back then he fished those big minnow baits, red fins and rapalas and stuff that very few people did. It kind of fits today's mentality more than even back then. Back then they were just fishing for 5-6 bites a day. They weren't fishing for, like Rick Clunn, 20, 25, 30, 42-pound bites a day. They were fishing for those bigger fish, and that's what you have to do now. So they were ahead of their time. Let's see what's it. And this last little deal, strictly the battle against aquatic vegetation. Probably the biggest, one of the biggest mistakes that we have made as human beings is declaring other things as invasive species when we're the largest one that ever was put on the planet. Because we move all over the planet. And so we complain every time something starts growing someplace we don't think it should be growing. And that's why we call some plants weeds. All weed is a plant that's growing in the wrong place in human mentality. And milfoil and aquatic vegetation and hydrilla, I'm not saying in small bodies of water they can't be, definitely a problem. But in large lakes and like Gunnersville and all these big lakes that this stuff goes in, gosh, it's the best habitat you can possibly have for what we like to do, and that's fishing. It just completes the whole ecosystem, from the smallest thing to the largest. Well, that concludes July, August 1982.